I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com. So, Eamon, we're going to talk today about a very intriguing foiled for some, but the actual cargo managed to make it. A drug plot that started really only coming up to Christmas of last year, and we have seen the 7 men that were arrested in connection with it have pleaded, and we've been to their sentence hearing, so we've heard their mitigating circumstances and why they got involved. So start with this ship that is loading up a cargo in Brazil to head for Limerick.
So yeah, this is the MV Royal, which is a 200-meter long Maltese flag ship. So it's a bulk carrier. It's quite big. I'd say anyone going out to it would see it from a long way off, no doubt. So that was in port in the Amazon, and it was taking on something like 40,000 tons of bauxite, which is the ore that's used to manufacture aluminium, and that was heading to the factory in Ogonish in County Limerick.
All of that was headed, or was the boat going?
Well, that's where the boat was going, and presumably it was going to dock there and offload whatever amount, whether it was all of it. I imagine most of it was destined for there, so they loaded up. Basically, there was 3 of the Philippine nationals crew who were on board. Like, one of them we know was his wages was €1,000 a month. They were all offered big money, like the equivalent in Philippine pesos of something like nearly €140,000. This is what was mentioned in court in one of the hearings, how much they were getting. And so they basically loaded up the 600 kilos. Now, this is estimate because, as we'll find out, the drugs were never actually found.
Yeah.
So they loaded up anyway, the 600 kilos, and they stored it in the bosun's store. So, and that guy was actually a fellow called Christopher Ampo. He was 44, has a wife, 2 kids at home who depend on him. This is all heard in court. And so he was basically keeping it on board.
So he's in charge of the store where it's been held. Now, there's 21 crew members in total on board this ship, the MV Royal, and 18 of them have no idea that there's cocaine on board.
Yeah, and there's another chap, Hans Pangahin, who's 36, and he'd taken on the responsibility of paying back $7,000 for his 4-year-old niece's chemotherapy. So there's an element, I suppose, of financial need there. And then there's Feljan Lau, 29. He was the youngest of the 3. He's with 2 daughters, 7 and 8. And there was kind of...
He's a single parent, a low-ranking seaman, and
Yeah, and it was suggested that, all these guys are really not at the top of the food chain. Now, some of them are obviously in contact, with the controllers. So some of them aren't. They're using phones with encryption or using encrypted apps on ordinary phones. They didn't actually say what was being used. I think there was a WhatsApp a group was set up at one point. So they're basically getting their instructions, that when they come into the foins, when they come in, into the Shannon Estuary, to go to the back of the boat and to let go, lower these bales down.
Drop them off into the Shannon Estuary where a rib boat or something.
Yeah, so this is the boat. So this is, basically the boat was going to be following them in darkness, I guess. This is on kind of early morning of January the 12th. So, I mean, it'd taken, I suppose, from December 27th to January 12th to get across the Atlantic. So while this is going on, you're getting the crew on board the MV Royal. They're getting instructions from somebody who's referred to as Immer Boss and had a Finnish SIM card and claimed to be based in Dubai. And then the guys who are now in Ireland awaiting to do the collection, they're being directed by a person called Albert using his Argentinian SIM card. And there's also another person called Daniel Green. Now, it's not a real name, that was also involved in directing these guys.
On the phones,
telling them where to be. They're like on January the 9th, there's coordinates of the MV Royal has been sent to one of the landing crews, one of their phones. So, I mean, what happened, I suppose, this week, we had one of those guys. His sentence hearing was on Monday this week, whereas the others, all the sentencing and all the mitigation was heard just before Christmas in December. So he was the last one to go. So we got to hear a bit about them as well. So Gary Monks, he's 41-year-old. He's a former British Army soldier. He served 8 years in the British Army, honourable discharge, and then went on to become a military contractor. So he was working in Iraq and Afghanistan for quite some time, like from 2008 to 2020 or something like that. You know, so he had a long career there, and obviously earning decent money. He had been recruited with a promise of €30,000 for doing this, and it was going to be possibly, there might be more in it if this went well. So,
and while evidence was given in relation to him, we also heard that he had post-traumatic stress disorder and some psychiatric problems brought on by some of what he saw when he was working in these regions, including at one point there was a car bomb went off in front of him and some of his colleagues were killed along with some local people, and that seemed to affect him greatly.
And it kind of pushed him on this kind of, I suppose, not a slow descent, but it pushed him on a descent where he was abusing drink and drugs as well.
From what, 2020 onwards?
From after so he wasn't able to go back to work because it was heard in court that he didn't really realise that he was suffering from this. I mean, it was actually referred to that he's known in the prison as the man who screams in his sleep at night. So I don't think he's faking it if he's kind of already known in the prison system as suffering from severe PTSD.
And his life kind of derails, we're told, in 2020 after working for a long period of time on good money in these regions. It wasn't mentioned, but would COVID have had anything to do with that, with his work? Would he have been, out of work?
Well, I think it was the fact, I suppose if you're used to that kind of money, if you're working as a military contractor in Baghdad or wherever, with a former military background, I mean, it wouldn't be unusual to be getting paid $3,000 to $4,000 a week. Yeah. So you're not going to make that kind of money when you return home to Scotland or Ireland without any, necessary skills. I mean, to make $3,000 a week, you want to be fairly decent at something, other than I suppose acting as a soldier, whether in a private capacity or for your country. So I mean, he was struggling, and I think that's also kind of seen in some of the other guys who were recruited as part of the landing crew. So we had a fisherman from Derry, Conor Costello, 31-year-old. He'd struggled with drugs and drink from a young age, and he left school early, and he made a fairly precarious living on trawlers. There wouldn't be great financial stability, whether you're going to be taken on for a crew. And he didn't turn down an offer when an opportunity came up to take part in this escapade. And then you had another Scottish man from Glasgow, the same as Gary Monks, Ryan Watson, 32-year-old. He'd some knowledge of boats, but he also had a 10 grand drug debt, which made him, I suppose, a perfect fit for the crew in that regard.
Right.
And the fourth guy that...
Watson, of course, had only just previous convictions of minor road traffic. So he, obviously, while he had some addiction issues and claims to have had this €10,000 debt, he hadn't come into difficulty with the law before.
No, none of them had any kind of anything in the background that would suggest they were going to get involved in what was clearly a highly organised, highly sophisticated international drug smuggling plot. Yeah. And there was nothing to suggest.
Watson was interesting as well, Eamon, just to interrupt you, because they talked about how throughout his life, he had worked. They said he worked in factories, he worked in a bread factory, in McVitie's biscuit factory, and working at Coca-Cola as a driver. He was a driver engineer and fixed machines, etc. So he is somebody who's had a steady time of it mostly until he's in a situation where this drug debt, we're told, spirals his life, basically. It's a foolish thing he's done, but to try and clear that debt, and before his son is born, because his partner is pregnant, he decides to take up this job.
Yeah, all seven of these guys had, a work history, which is, while, I suppose to a lot of listeners, it's kind of so what, but when you sit in court a lot, especially in criminal courts, having a work history is sometimes unusual, and it's touted it's put out there as to something to be taken in consideration, that here it was a person who was once a useful member of society. Yeah. Don't lose sight of that when you're going to lock him up, Judge. And that's, I suppose, the way they're coming at it. And that was reflected in as well in the seventh guy. I can't really pronounce his name properly, Mihan Koprovica, who is a 46-year-old Serbian living in the UK. He's a married man with two boys, 7 and 15, and he also had a clean criminal record as well, and a strong work history.
His wife is an accountant, I think, and gets a job in the UK, and they become British citizens.
Yeah.
They're very settled. no explanation as regards why he needed to make the quick.
No,
money.
presumably, yeah. It's all down to the money, and I mean, like we know, we've heard that the crew members on board that the MV Royal were getting close to 140,000. That Gary Monks was
Euro
getting,
or
the equivalent of,
right.
of 140,000 euro. It was Philippine peso sum that they were promised. I think it was 138,558 euro was the exact conversion.
It's a lot of money.
It is, yeah. And one of them,
quite life-changing.
One of them had already been paid 80,000 of that, and another been paid 7,000 of that. So this is all part of the mitigation that we heard. And I suppose it kind of speaks to the motivation, but it's also, again, it just shows you as well, like the sheer organizational ability of like this crime group to put together, a plot like this with so many various moving parts across various jurisdictions, and to be able to recruit people, to prey on the people with exactly the right weakness, but enough skills to possibly carry it off. And you did make the point that, it was a drug plot that was foiled, but I'd suggest it wasn't. That just because 7 of, we don't know how many people were involved, but I'm sure it was probably plus 30 people were involved.
Yeah.
So the fact that 7 out of that amount for 44 million, possibly more, cocaine to get that successfully landed into Ireland and spirited away.
And to the drug gang, totally dispensable workers.
It's a complete success. It's a total success. Even if they have to, send, a grand a month to these guys' wives and girlfriends or whatever to keep everyone quiet.
And would they, if they're honourable? Because you see, I thought what was interesting was, and the evidence given was that there wasn't a sense of having to keep them quiet, because they described how they were working in cell structures. You had the landing cell. Now, one of those landing cells, which included the guys we're just talking about, Monks, etc., they were caught. But there was clearly other landing cells, and the cells didn't know anything about one another. And the people working within the cells didn't know each other either.
Yeah.
So they were kind of strangers put together. So if you do get caught, you only know what you are supposed to have done. I mean, it was a classic.
And even the 4 guys, like in, say, the cell that Gary Monks was part of, I mean, they more or less arrived in North Kerry separately to some extent. No, he did travel, I think, with Costello, but the other 2 guys arrived in separately. So, there was a real kind of... it was a deliberate thing to keep everyone in the dark as far as possible. I mean, they launched from Meganine Pier and went out, collected the drugs, dropped them to another location. They're not sure where. It could easily have been in County Clare, the other side of the estuary. It'd be quite easy for them to have done that, or somewhere else in North Kerry. And then they landed back then without the cocaine back in Meganine Pier.
Which is where they were arrested.
Which is where they were arrested, because in the days beforehand they had actually kind of caused a bit of suspicion.
Yeah.
And the guards had, I think, put in an operation. When they were alerted to this at 4 a.m, they more or less caught them red-handed as they came back in and seized all the phones. And it was on those phones that all the evidence really was based. And there was kind of the back and forth between the guys on the boat. They were kind of, They were basically having to kind of show, I suppose, proof that the mission, that the assignment was continuing.
Yeah.
So they were having to send these pictures back to the controllers and to each other. So that's kind of the height of the evidence. Plus then the fact that there's no great explanation offered.
So we can presume that the bags of cocaine, which were dropped off the back of the ship, and I think the ship did remain anchored in the estuary near Kilrush. Is that where?
Yeah, it's that area.
Went off the back of it. So they were GPS tracked. So the landing crew went out, picked it up, and delivered it somewhere. They have never spoken about.
No,
what happened then. Okay.
No, and they'll and they can probably with full credibility be able to say we don't know who we're dealing with.
Yeah.
They probably don't. I mean, there might have been someone else who might have recruited them further back, but
so they could quite easily have been told to offload it again off that rib at another location, another GPS.
Location. Well, that's exactly. It was landed somewhere else. It wasn't landed where they took off from and where they returned to, where they were arrested by the guards.
So the Gardai were on this. They knew about this. There was intelligence, obviously, that this shipment of drugs was coming in. The mistake could have been that they believed that landing crew they were watching had under surveillance were going to land the drugs back to where they came back in, and they were unaware of a second landing crew that were there. So even more sophistication shown really by the drug gang involved.
Yeah, and if and I suppose like the Shannon Estuary is a perfect spot in a way that unless you already have a helicopter in the air and units on both sides of the estuary, you're not going to be able to redirect whatever resources you have on one side to the other, unless you're coming fully equipped with helicopter assets and boats in the estuary and units on both sides. I mean, it would take a huge amount of resources, and we don't know exactly how much time the guards had to react to this. It could have been a matter of minutes or hours, or whether it was longer than that. We don't really know at this stage.
Yeah. So what's scooped up, or the people scooped up, are those workers, and they're very low down the chain when it comes to drug smuggling. I thought what was interesting was the 3 Filipino men have issues regarding money. They're living in a country where there is no healthcare, where there is no social services. One of them in particular, you mentioned, has a...
Yes, Pangahin had the 4-year-old niece.
So he has a niece, and he says that she's 4 years of age and she's very close to me as she goes to school with my daughter. They're the same age. She has been diagnosed with cancer, and there's no... You have to pay for that in the Philippines. There is no free healthcare. So he talks about the chemo is very expensive, so he gets a job on the ship. He says, my superior in the ship approached me and offered me some extra money to do an extra job. I thought I was smuggling only tobacco. He describes that in the beginning, that he thought it was tobacco, and then he learns that it's actually drugs. He's the primary breadwinner in that family. Lau, who's the 29-year-old, is the single parent. He seems to be supporting his 2 daughters, aged 7 and 8, plus his parents who look after them. And he got letters to court from his mother and from others. And again, it's the money that's the motivation. But when you come to the non-Filipino, there's 2 Scottish, is there 3 Scottish?
2 Scottish
and a guy from
Irish,
Derry.
And a UK citizen.
Yeah, and each one of those cite that they have issues with alcohol and drug
drugs,
dependency, or both.
And
a tale of 2 worlds, really, there, isn't it?
Both talk about having PTSD as well.
I mean, look, obviously this is a major drug cartel behind it. We're surmising that there is certainly word of a director in Dubai. There's only a few groupings that can ship this kind of amount of cocaine across the sea and who have the sophistication to organise these kind of operations. Many of them would be either the Kinahans or their sort of partners in that European super cartel. You were suggesting the Serbian connection might suggest Eden Gassanen. And didn't he before have involvement in recruiting crew members for the ship in the MSV Guyane, which was caught in Philadelphia?
Yeah, 20 ton. Yeah.
Yes.
And there's quite a number. Yeah, that was the whole kind of, I suppose they're Bosnian Serbs, and they specialised in recruiting mariners because so many of those people had gone to work for, the big cargo ships.
Yeah.
So they had an in there, and they'd hit up these people when they came home to visit, and they'd more than often get an offer they can't refuse. They'd either take the money or face retribution. And in some cases, the money was quite good. You're talking 6-figure sums. €1 million, I think, was one of them for one of the top guys. I mean, they had people at a high level on that particular boat.
And I've no doubt, like with everything, it's better to have somebody willing than somebody under threat, because, when it comes to these arrests, and I mean, these people are expected to stay quiet. I don't honestly think any of us could expect really any of these people who have families out there to start identifying higher up members of violent cartels who will carry out, threats or retributions to their families. These people are going to be locked up for a period of time. We'll talk about that in a moment, what the likelihood of their sentencing is going to be. But before we do that, this was the 3rd sort of big shipment. Now, this one got in, and we've no idea how many times this same route was practiced before it was blown, essentially. So these drugs landed somewhere in Ireland, we imagine, and were redistributed. €42 million worth of cocaine is probably not just for the Irish market. It's probably, once it's landed, it's broken up and it's transported in as many different ways. And when it's landed, that's the point that law enforcement are really chasing their tails, because they're not going to seize the big cargo. They're going to have to follow various trucks or jeeps or whatever it is that's moving them. But this one is a third one of these big shipments that are kind of come to our notice with the Gardai over a short period of time. The first one being the MV Matthew, which was a very successful operation by the Gardai and the Army Ranger Wing. And it was on foot of intelligence coming in from various different countries, and presumably Europol or what's the MAOC?
The Maritime Intelligence,
Intelligence Service. So in that case, the MV Matthew was tracked, and the Army Rangers ultimately, the ship behaved bizarrely. There was all sorts of things going on with the captain, and people were losing their nerve, and there was definitely instructions coming from Dubai at that stage as to what to do. And in actual fact, the instructions were, because the Irish Gardai had copped that this ship was containing cocaine, it was run like hell. Do not give up the cargo. Just get out of Irish waters. There was wrong instructions given that Irish could only police to a certain, if they could get
certain limits
get it
offshore. Yeah,
exactly. So that was the MV Matthew, and we've gone over that quite a bit. But there was another one.
Don't forget the MV Matthew, though, was 3 times the size of the one we're talking about in the MV Royal. So I mean, while MV Royal might be one, Matthew was a whole nother, I suppose, level of scale again. And we don't know if there's ships that have successfully come in with twice what the MV Matthew had.
Yeah, and so there have been. So, but in between the MV Matthew and the MV Royal is another ship called the Cool Explorer. Now, 7 people arrested. Of the 10 have pleaded guilty in this case, and there's another 3 still before the courts. But in that one, have you the details of what happened? That was even more sophisticated.
Yeah, it was slightly bigger again. It was 840 kilos, probably valued at about 58 million. Now, I suppose like the MV Royal, the guards didn't get it, but at the same time, the drug dealers in this case didn't get it.
Right.
But they sent out again one of these kind of rib boats. They're kind of semi-inflatable. They're ocean going. This particular one was really well equipped. Everything that needed to be blacked out was blacked out. The suspicion is you had one of these cigarette boat drivers from the south of Spain doing runs for years between Morocco and Spain had been drafted in. They clocked up something like just under 1,000 kilometers chasing the Cool Explorer, trying to get this consignment of drugs. And for whatever reason, they weren't able to do it. There was 2 crewmen. The whole thing was like full of fuel. They were off the coast of Cornwall at one point, really.
Right.
So whatever happened anyway, the drugs, they didn't make it. So it looks like there was a second attempt to either dump the drugs or to leave them off somewhere, but they were washed up in a beach near Jutland in Denmark.
So they threw them overboard clearly during this chase.
Well, whether they threw them overboard during that chase it was their own people that were coming to get it. So obviously they couldn't make the rendezvous for whatever reason. I suppose it's a difficult thing to do with 2 things moving at speed in a wide open ocean, which shows you like how difficult it actually is.
Yeah.
I mean, the one in Foynes, it was next best to being an inshore kind of operation, in that they were in the estuary. So you'd have lights on the shore to be able to kind of guide you. You'd be able to see the boat. It was that big anyway. Whereas if you're in the open ocean, it's a totally different ballgame, like in terms of sophistication.
So what happened with the Cool Explorer? It was trying to drop off to the rigid inflatable boat. Didn't happen. They were off the coast of Cornwall.
Yeah, and they would have been back into West Cork, back in Skibbereen. Tragumna Pier was where they were going to, well, that's where they launched from, and that's where they came back to. And again, the locals got suspicious of these guys. The guards appeared on the scene, arrested them. You remember the picture of the guys with the camper van, they're all on the ground. So, the guards have moved in on them. And they found kind of, all the kind of the necessary equipment needed to make one of these rendezvous. You don't need that kind of stuff if you're a fisherman, if you're a sports fisherman.
And what was the suggestion of the camper van? Was that for cover? It was to look as if they were sort of tourists in the area fishing and boating.
That's part of it. Plus, it was probably a handy way to transport people together.
Yeah.
And I mean, and I suppose it'll bring you on to as well, like in terms of the sentencing. But also, I noticed as well that there was a Serbian national as well who was part of that group as well. Now, the guy in the MV Royal case that we're talking about first, Kropovica, he was actually described as the notary. He was the guy who was sent by the organisation to oversee, to make sure everything went to plan, and to make sure, obviously, nobody got light-fingered with the cargo.
And that's interesting in that that's a higher role than most of the others, but he was somebody with no criminal record and his wife was an accountant and they had come to live in England sometime previous.
It really does kind of speak to the whole multinational nature of this type of crime. You know, when you're moving drugs from one side of the world to the other, using people from various different backgrounds, whatever way, you know, this is working. I mean, you go back to if you go back to the Traugumna Pier, the attempt to get the drugs off the Cool Explorer. So, I mean, you had an Iranian an Iranian national who was resident in the Netherlands. You had Spanish. You know, you had, again, you know, this whole kind of smorgasbord of nationalities of people, you know, involved. I suppose they're putting people together that wouldn't normally be together. And the idea that you have these like almost like football managers selecting a team or putting a team together to go out and do this. And obviously they're getting well paid. I mean, we know that Gary Monks was being offered €30,000. So, I mean, some of these guys could be being offered more of that, or, you know, or even a percentage of you know, of what's landed.
A gamble, though, isn't it? I mean, if you're caught, and obviously these guys have been caught. We talk about sentencing because these will be sentenced towards the end of March. But you look back on other cases like this. I mean, I'm going back a good while when I talk about the Lucky Day, but it was a similar kind of a plot. In actual fact, 10 times the value of the drugs. And of course, it was one of the earlier that we know of plots to go out to meet a boat, a catamaran at sea, to transfer the drugs to a rib. And a series of mishaps occurred, which ended up, they put the wrong fuel into the engine of the rib, and the rib with all the cocaine on it essentially sank, and the cocaine was floating around Dunlop Bay. Now, in that case, there was a number of men that were arrested. One of them, a guy called Gerard Hagan, pleaded guilty. And of course, the plea of guilty is important because it's seen as saving the courts, the cost of a trial. It's also seen as a sign of essentially admission and somewhat remorse. And Gerard Hagan got 10 years. And I think the others, you might recall some of them.
Yeah, Perry Whirry from Essex, he got 30 years. Joe Daly from Kent got 25. And I remember some of them were appealed and upheld, as far as I remember.
And there's the other guy who only got out recently, Martin Wandon.
Martin Wandon, yeah, as well. I mean, they were serious. These guys were pretty serious criminal organisation. One of them was an ex-Met
officer, yeah. But they went to trial, so they didn't admit their guilt at all, and they went to trial, and the evidence was heard, etc. They were found guilty, so they got those very hefty sentences at the time.
And it was what was it, a ton and a half of cocaine?
A huge amount. 10 times what was on this MV Royal. So now you have each of these individuals has pleaded guilty, and they have put forward their circumstances really to explain why they took up this role. More recent cases similar, you're seeing 8 to 12 years for these sentences.
Yeah, that's the one with the Cool Explorer. The guys there who pleaded guilty, the sentences came in at 8 to 11 years between the various individuals. That's what they got. But again,
and it would depend on their role in the cell structure, whether they had a controlling role.
Yeah, I think so. And that's the way the judges will look at it. And if there's anything in the background in terms of previous conviction. And I mean, and with the MV Royal guys, including Gary Monks, it was put to the judge with each of the defendants by the different counsel that they pleaded guilty at the earliest moment they could. We're talking about a trial with 114, 120 witnesses, would have gone on for months. So they're making the point, like, you know, this has to be worth something in terms of mitigation. And it always is rewarded. It's always taken into account.
Yeah, sure.
It's unlikely they'll get, you know, it will give them something off the headline of the sentence, which is, in a sense, proper order. Like, you know, I mean, it saves a huge amount of time and resources, all the cards and just the legal fees alone, as there will be, of course, entitled to free legal aid. So, I mean, all of that would just go on for months. It'd be hugely complex, because it was all based on phone evidence and I'm sure there'd be CCTV and phone tracking and all that stuff. And it's just interminable.
And how unusual is it to see these cases when the drugs are never seized? You're putting guys on trial plead guilty, but you're putting them before the courts for a plot to import cocaine that just...
It didn't work. Yeah, well, why should you get off just because you missed out? It's I mean, if you shoot at someone and miss, you're still going to be charged with a crime or attempted murder.
But presumably from an investigative point of view, there was sampling where the cocaine had been in the boat, and they were able to prove that there was cocaine in the boat. They were able to...
I think that
prove through the phone messages how much they were dealing with.
Presumably they must have had, but there was also pictures of the cocaine as well.
Because a photograph was sent.
Yeah, and there is admissions. There was more than one photograph. Apparently there was a lot of phone evidence, and that was mentioned in court that the phone evidence was really the main body of evidence against the guys involved in the MV Royal plot.
Right. The phones always get them. But what do you do if you're, traveling across the world at sea and try to keep in communication? There's only one way you can do that, really, isn't there? And that's on a phone or some sort of a satellite equipment.
I mean, you do wonder, if with all the resources at hand and people who, I'm sure they can hire plenty of ex-special forces from countries like Venezuela and Colombia and, or even, I'm sure, in European guys who'd do it for the money, who would have all the expertise, and these organizations, they'd be big enough to buy government level, encrypted communications in the Middle East or whatever, and to use them. And I'm sure some of them are, and I'm sure there's other plots out there. You'd nearly be suspicious that were these guys kind of set up to fail while something else was going on, and that's a bonus if it gets through, because it does seem a bit retro, the way they were working. Anybody, who turns up with, a non-Irish accent, with a 25 grand rib, on your foreign registered Range Rover in an Airbnb in the dead of winter, going out at night. What else are you going to think he's doing?
Well, exactly. And funny, that earlier plot I was talking to you about, which saw Jared Hagan get the 10 years and Martin Wandon and others get much longer. They had actually come to stay in the area for months and weeks beforehand to settle in as if they were just very wealthy tourists. And they had brought over the rib boats and the jeeps and everything bit by bit. So it looked like they were kind of boys' toys, and they were rich English tourists in the area. And it was certainly a lot more thought of than certainly these two. The camper van guys and with the rib boat, etc. Do you think they were scrambled last minute?
It's hard to know. I mean, it really is. I don't think so. I don't think they were scrambled last minute. I mean, these plots... I mean, if you've ever tried to organise a stag night in Newcastle or a hen night in Clifton, you know how hard it is. So, I mean, if you're trying to get, 30 people to coordinate across an ocean and to get a boat and someone to drive it and someone to load and offload and somebody to coordinate things, it's not that easy. It doesn't happen quickly. I mean, these plots would, at the very least, I would imagine there's months and months go into the planning. You might have multiple similar plots going at the same time, so there's an economy of scale for an organisation doing something like that. But for the individuals involved, it would be an ongoing kind of. It's a long project. I don't think it's scrambled at the last minute. I mean, maybe they were. Maybe they were trying to offload it quicker than they should have been, or something like that, which is kind of to their detriment in the end.
Now, it certainly shows us how vulnerable our coastline is and how suitable Ireland is for landing these big, huge shipments. I mean, again and again.
So if you read our former colleague Des Eakin's book all about the pirates in the southeast, the south coast and west coast of Ireland, Des's books are brilliant. Back from the 1700s,
right?
Nothing but smuggling going on.
Yeah, there will have been,
and double crosses and gangsters called chief leaders and all the rest.
3,000 kilometres of coastline, I think we have, or thereabouts. And what about the Navy and what's happening as regards as policing? I mean, you obviously just can't police the seas the way you can put, roadblocks on land. It's a huge, vast area of sea. a lot of this stuff, I think most of it, these kind of like successes or when these guys are undone, it's purely because of intelligence, isn't it?
A lot of it is, or just being unlucky. I mean,
Yeah.
Kilmac Bay, was
Weather.
they put the diesel in the petrol engine.
Yeah.
Or weather, of course, as well is a huge thing. And your boat gets a puncture, like, the inflatable part anyway.
Yeah.
Or, the engine breaks down and all of a sudden you have to make contact with a local who's going, why are these guys looking to get this boat repaired in the middle of winter?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's I suppose there's so many things that can go wrong. And of course, if your crew is made up of fellas with drink and drug issues, okay, they might be fine for the first day or two, but if you have to keep them hanging on for another week, maybe things will start to unravel a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, look, another interesting plot undone. We'll return to this for the sentencing at the end of March and see how these guys fare out. Thanks a million, Eamon.
Always a pleasure, Nicola.